I think you've got to ensure that there's explicit alignment about the mandate before the first candidate gets interviewed. So if you're a CEO and you're listening to this, you need to get your board and your executive team aligned on three things: what the person owns in terms of the business problems, what they influence without owning, and what success looks like in the language of the business, not the language that HR uses.
Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my friend, my co-host, Scott Morris. He is a CHRO with the scar tissues to prove it, the unconfirmed finalist in a jargon-free HR writing contest that he claims to have won with decisive stakeholder alignment. And he's also the founder of Propulsion AI. Now, hey, Scott, we've been circling a topic for a while that I keep coming back to. Organizations hire the wrong CHRO, and not because the candidates are wrong, but because the role definition was wrong before anyone was ever interviewed. And the root of that problem is a job description that's built for the wrong job. I've looked at more CHRO job descriptions than I can count, especially recently, and most of them read like a senior HR generalist profile with the phrase strategic partner dropped in somewhere, usually around paragraph 3.
I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Jackson. But hey, I'm going to do something different here. Before we dive into this subject, I want everybody to know that your CHRO Ascent Academy is kicking off in early May, or the newest cohort. The first cohort that you put through gave you rave reviews. That's launched 2 new classes, and one of them is for sitting CHROs, and one of them is similar material, but for leaders that are one step away from the CHRO role. Both are likely to sell out quickly, everybody. So check the agenda, check the pricing, check the timelines. You can find it all at mytalentsherpa.com.
Hey, thanks, Scott. And let's dive in. Every CHRO search eventually arrives at the same question. Are we looking for the right person? And that feels exactly like the right question to ask. But here's what we're going to be doing today, what we're going to dig into. The role definition has to come before the talent decision. Because if the role is defined incorrectly, then the wrong person gets hired almost every time, even when the individual they select is genuinely excellent.
And you know what? Here's what I think makes this interesting is that a lot of organizations approach the CHRO search through a competency frame. You know, what kind of expertise does this person need? What kind of functions do they have to run? What transformation experience are they going to bring with them from their past? And those are all reasonable questions if you're staffing a senior HR team. But I think you and I both think that they're the wrong questions if you're trying to put an enterprise operator into the role.
Oh, that's 1,000% true. And I was talking to a CEO recently who had gone through 2 CHROs in 3 years. Different backgrounds, same result. Neither person was operating at the business enterprise level. He asked me to take a look at it. When I did, the job description they used was basically the same in both searches. It was, I would tell you, it felt like an HRVP document with a CHRO label and a little equity on top. They had 17 bullet points. 12 of those were about managing the function, 4 around business partnership without really defining what that is. And I think there was one about driving culture. Nothing in that document connected the business outcomes that the CEO actually needed from the role.
You know, the Academy to Innovate HR's executive survey puts the number pretty plainly. Fewer than 20% of CHROs are viewed by their CEO as key contributors to the business strategy. That's a real problem. And the number surprises people when they hear it, but it shouldn't. Because if the job description describes an HR function manager, that's exactly what it is that you're going to attract. And it's exactly what it is that you're going to hire. The mandate signal was wrong before the search ever started.
Yeah, I think that's right. And think about what the document actually communicates. It tells every candidate reading it what the organization believes the job is for. It tells the person who gets hired what success looks like from their very first week. And if the signal says manage the HR function and be a good partner to the business, whatever that means, it's not a mandate for somebody who's supposed to be in the room when capital allocation decisions are being made.
I like that our audience is growing in terms of the number of CEOs that are listening. And I use this comparison when I talk to CEOs about it. Imagine writing a COO job description the way we write a CHRO job description, right? That COO job description would say things like manage operations and ensure process efficiency and be a strategic partner to the CEO. Few leaders would accept that framing from a chief operating officer role. We would say immediately that it misses the mandate entirely. The CHRO has the same problem, but we've been accepting it for decades.
And the job descriptions that actually produce business level CHROs read more like what you were describing the COO real job descriptions look like. They anchor on business priorities in the next 24 months, and they define the CHRO's accountability as clearing the human capital constraints between here and there. I tend to measure those in terms of revenue per head, leadership bench strength, executional reliability, speed of talent decision making under pressure. And think about it this way: when Patty McCord was building the people function at Netflix, which if you're listening to this and you don't know what they did, go look that up. That is basically where we want all human capital to be headed. They never asked, how do we run great HR? What they did ask was, what kind of people do we need to build the company that we're building? That's a very different question. And every decision about the HR function flowed from that.
So I think what we're really naming is a mandate design problem, right? Before you ever, pick up the phone to call a search firm, especially if you're using a search firm, you've already made a decision about what you think the job is all about. For most organizations, that decision gets made by pulling up the last job description and then changing a few words and then posting it. And I don't just say that because of the kind of work that we're trying to do at Propulsion AI, but I think that's just about how everybody does it right now.
It is, which is why I think most people need to be reaching out to you for help, because you can help them get through that. But before we turn this into a Scott Morris commercial, which, let's be honest, every time you're around, it's a Scott Morris commercial.
Wow.
Let's call out some of the faulty assumptions that keep leaders locked in the patterns that we just talked about. The first one that I hear consistently is, we know what we need. We need someone who can run HR at a high level and also, if they have extra time, operate at the business level. So, Scott, how many times have you heard that one sentence?
You know the answer to that, more than I can count. And here's what the sentence is actually doing. It treats those two things as a single competency set, same skill profile, right? Built up the same way over a career. But running an HR function at a high level and operating as a business operator are built through fundamentally different career trajectories. And I realized that firsthand when I was not only chief people officer, but chief of staff to the CEO and had deep board involvement. And I recognized the difference that was required as a result of that dual role. One of those is built through deep functional expertise. The other one is built for direct accountability for business outcomes.
Yeah, neither of us are saying that person can't exist doing both, but they absolutely can, and they do. I think I might be an example of that. But when your framing is going into the search with a job description that leads with HR expertise, and you end up filtering for the wrong starting point from the very beginning, and you look for depth at the functional lane, and you hope that the business acumen shows up as a byproduct. And I'll give you a real life example. I'm in a search mode right now. I got a note from a search person earlier today who said, "Hey, would you please describe to me the relationship that you have with the general counsel?" Like, that's not what I'm bringing to the table. Like, that just told me something about that job and how they see that job. Because for most of us, like that's a very important partnership, and you need to define the lenses through which you look at it. You need to look at the decision rights that are associated with it. But if that is what they're looking at from the candidate saying, I need to understand more about that, like, that tells you something really important.
Yeah. I think when you frame the job in those terms too, you naturally and regrettably screen out some very genuinely capable candidates, people who have built, real business operator instincts, but they've come through very unconventional paths. They look different on paper. The job description's already eliminated them before anybody reads their resume.
The second assumption is one that Scott and I have been guilty of. I shouldn't speak for you. I've been guilty of. And that's the idea that the job description's job is done when it attracts the candidates. Write it to get the resumes, to get the candidates, post it, move on to the interviews, and we'll do the right stuff in the interviews.
Right. I mean, so you know how I feel about people who write job descriptions and then try and post the job description rather than letting the job description do what it's supposed to do, which is create clarity for the individual when you put them in the role, and let the marketing copy, the posting, do the work of attracting the candidates. If you want to call it job descriptions that were almost entirely optimized for attracting applicants, and a document designed for attracting applicants is different. It's a different artifact than a document designed to define a mandate. And that's why I feel so incredibly strongly that you got to treat them like two different documents, right? The first one lists activities. The second one lists business constraints that the role is accountable for clearing. And those two documents produce a completely different interview conversation.
And when a document is a marketing piece, you interview for capability in the abstract. When it's a mandate document, now you're interviewing for fit against very specific business problems that need to be solved in a specific time horizon. You see the difference? I think it's a quality of signal that you get from the candidates. The difference is substantial.
Many CEOs believe that a CHRO who comes in strong on the HR side will eventually translate the expertise into business impact, that they'll somehow learn the language. But then they earn their way into the strategic conversation. Given enough context, given enough time, they'll get there. And I'm not sure that that's true.
Yeah, look, I understand that logic. The problem, however, is the data. The CHRO turnover has been running about a third above its 6-year average. Close to 20% of new CHROs are now serving under 2 years in role. I think we shared some stats a little bit ago that said we are running about 50% higher in the CHRO relative to the balance of the C-suite. So you don't have to agree on any specific data point, but they're all pointing to the same thing. And so if the development plan assumes that they're going to earn their way into business altitude during their tenure, I think you got to be very frank about the fact that runway might not be there for them.
Let's be clear about something else too, about that dynamic. The CHRO who comes in with deep HR expertise, but limited business context, they're not doing anything wrong. And we're not being critical of that. They're delivering exactly what that mandate has asked them to deliver. The job description told them what the job was, and they are doing that job. The misalignment is architectural. It's not personal.
Yeah, I think that reframe matters a lot, Scott, because the reflex when a CHRO is not operating at the business level is to look at the person. The harder question, though, is whether the mandate ever created accountability for operating that way. Like the job description, and I don't mean to keep harping on this, but the job description usually makes the decision before anybody was hired. So that's where you need to start.
You're right to harp on it. But let me push us forward to the fourth assumption. And I think this one could be probably the most damaging. The belief that a new CHRO can and should reshape the mandate after they arrive, right? After they're in that role. That somehow a strong operator will come in and redefine the role through their own performance. And the organization is going to bend around them and their attitude. That's the belief.
Yeah, in theory, a strong operator can absolutely expand the mandate over time. And in fact, I'm working on right now something that I'm going to make available for purchase that will help a CHRO and a CEO come together on that. More details to come. If it's done by the time this thing posts, it'll be in the show notes. But here's the practical reality. The CHRO who's walking in on day one, they're walking into a running system. There are already fires. There are already deliverables that were handed off during the transition. The HR function has expectations about what the new leader is going to go do. And that kind of lock-in is very real, and it's very, very powerful.
Yeah, and reshaping a mandate from inside of a running system is exponentially harder than designing the mandate before the search begins. But that's really, really hard work. A CHRO who spends the first 18 months working to redefine the role is spending 18 months not delivering the outcomes that the business needed from them, that they wrote into that job description. That's a cost, and it shows up long before the performance review makes it visible.
Yeah, which is exactly why this work belongs before the post goes live, not during onboarding, not after the hire.
Not
Literally.
in,
I'm sorry?
and not in the interview process.
No, certainly not in the interview process. Like, okay, but before we get moving on to some of what to do about it, I do want to make sure we name the mechanism that keeps this thing from self-correcting. So we talked about this last week, and I think you said something that reframed it for me. And that problem is not the job description per se. It's the problem where organizations start when they decide what a CHRO role is for. Could you talk us through that?
Well, here's the loop as I see it. An organization needs a new CHRO. They go and they do what everybody does. They pull the last job description, they update it to reflect current language. Maybe the CEO has some words that are really important to him or her. Maybe they add something about AI or transformation, and then they go and they post it. And the document leads with HR domain expertise because it's never been changed, because the last version didn't change it either. And the search yields primarily HR professionals. And then they hire the strongest of that candidate pool.
Yeah, so taking this forward, the person comes in, delivers against the mandate that they were given, which is running a HR function and being a partner. So that's what they do. And 12 to 18 months later, the CEO looks up and says, this person is a great functional leader, but they are not operating at the altitude that I need.
And the instinct is to run another search and not to change the document. And the loop starts all over again. Personnel decisions are visible. The CHRO is not working out. That's legible, right? The job architecture is invisible. The document that created the constraint is filed away and forgotten months ago.
So in my advisory practice, I've spent years coaching CHROs on how to expand their influence and operate at a business altitude without ever pointing it to the job description of the root cause. And it's one of those where you kind of go on in life and you realize that oh my God, I'm part of the problem, because I was treating the symptom because the symptom was right in front of me. And I was treating it as a talent problem. And we did a pod a few weeks back where 95% of the issues or 94% are process system issues, 6% is talent. And I was doing it the opposite way. So the design failure was invisible to me too.
Well, and the CEOs are smart people, and it's invisible to them too. And the system doesn't self-correct because the CEO who approved the job description and the CEO who is frustrated with the CHRO 18 months later have never connected those two events, right? They're separated by a search process and an onboarding and a full quarter of business performance and a year of accumulated impressions. The document is long gone from working memory.
And that gap is exactly where the architectural failure lives. If someone's leaving and they have an exit interview, it's gonna surface that we need a different profile. And usually that pendulum swings the opposite direction. But the design failure that produced that outcome never actually gets named.
Okay, so you and I are practical guys. What breaks the loop?
Well, I hate to give this to our bosses, but the CEO has to, or someone with the access and the credibility to sit with the CEO before the search goes live. Maybe that's someone on the board, and they ask, hey, before we post this, what's the problem these people are being hired to solve? Not what HR activities do we need covered. Those are not the same thing. And what business constraints need to be cleared up in the next 24 months? What kind of person can actually clear them? I think that is the actual, someone has to have that conversation, and it's probably at the CEO and the board level.
I like that. I like where you're starting to go. Let's shift and let's reframe this problem. How do we move from writing an HR job description to designing a business mandate? I want to give this, a frame that we can make it, more concrete inside of it. Let's call it the mandate design framework. There are 3 specific shifts that you make before the document ever gets written.
Yeah, and I don't think any of these are really technically complicated. They don't require a new process or a new tool, although I'm going to sell one. They require a CEO to start from a different place than most CHRO searches start from.
And it's one of the reasons that I'm really thankful that our audience of CEOs is growing, because this is a place where their leadership really makes a difference. Here's shift 1, moving from competency profile to constraint map. The traditional approach asks what competencies a great CHRO needs. And you get a list: change management experience, executive presence, cross-functional partnership, HR domain depth, right? Those things are real, but they're inputs. The constraint map asks a different question. What are the 2 or 3 human capital constraints that are most directly threatening our business priorities over the next 24 months? It's a completely different question, right? Is it leadership, bench that is unable to carry us into the next phase of growth? Is there a talent density problem in the roles that are going to be most influential over operating margin? Is it our execution reliability, and is that low because accountability and decision rights are unclear? That's where the conversation has to start. That's where the thinking has to start.
Yeah, and you've watched the constraint map conversation change the entire shape of a search or an incumbency. I have too, because the constraint map produces a different job. If the primary constraint is bench strength, you need a CHRO who can build and run a talent development system that produces enterprise leaders. That is a specific capability. It's not the same person that you might need if your constraint is building a scalable talent acquisition infrastructure to support rapid geographic expansion.
And when you build the job description from the constraint map, then candidates understand exactly what the problems are that they're being brought in to solve. Not to be a strategic partner, which can have, N different meanings, but the actual problems that are really impacting business performance and the consequences of not solving those problems and what success looks like when those problems are solved. That changes to a certain degree who raises their hand for the job to begin with.
Amen. And so let's move on to shift number 2. And I think that's from HR deliverables to business outcomes. And in my experience, most CHRO job descriptions are written in HR language, usually by the search firm. I don't know if the CEO actually ever reads it. If so, it's just to make sure that nothing stupid is in there that doesn't fit. So you see things like reduce attrition, improve engagement scores, modernize the HRIS, get the trains running on time, build out a learning and development capacity in the business. Like, those are all really good activities. They're probably necessary, but they're not sufficient as a mandate. So the reframe anchors the role to what the business produces. So think about it this way, like reduce voluntary attrition becomes improve revenue per head by addressing the tenure cliff in the first year cohort. Or modernize the HRIS becomes increase the speed of talent decision making so that the business leaders can have real-time data to act in the moment versus waiting a quarter.
You're right about that. And the difference in those 2 framings shows up in every conversation that you're going to have with every candidate that you're going to talk to. One framing involves somebody coming to manage a function, and the other invites somebody to come and solve a business problem. Maybe they solve it the way you're thinking about it. Maybe they solve it a different way, but the focus is definitely different. The talent pool that responds to those is not necessarily the same.
Yeah, I'll be a little sardonic on this one word of the day. We don't write the COO job description that says improve operational satisfaction scores. We write them to say reduce per unit cost by this amount at this scale over this time horizon without compromising product quality or safety. That's a business outcome. The CHRO mandate should make the same translation in the same language with the same specificity.
All right, shift number 3. Moving from role definition to mandate alignment. I think this is the hardest shift because the document is the output and it's not the work. The real work is the conversation and the thinking that has to happen before anybody puts pen to paper, so to speak, and writes a word, right? Most organizations draft the CHRO job description in a small group. At least I think they do. And the CEO probably doesn't write it. The CEO does review it. The board might look at it. But the mandate, which is what this person is going to own and what they're going to influence and what authority they're going to have and what success looks like at 12 months or at 24 months. Now, that alignment rarely happens explicitly before the search starts.
Yeah. And so you go through that whole process. The new CHRO arrives on day 1 and they quickly discover that the CEO has one picture of the role, and the board has a different picture, and the executive team has a third, and you're chasing ghosts. And the job description said strategic partner, but it didn't say to whom or why and where with what actual authority. And every stakeholder has the rational claim of their time and attention, and all of them grounded in something that the document implied. So what do you do?
Well, I think you've got to ensure that there's explicit alignment about the mandate before the first candidate gets interviewed. So if you're a CEO and you're listening to this, you need to get your board and your executive team aligned on three things: what the person owns in terms of the business problems, what they influence without owning, and what success looks like in the language of the business, not the language that HR uses. Kathleen Hogan's mandate at Microsoft is worth referencing here, right? Her remit was explicitly tied to culture transformation as the mechanism for executing a specific business strategy, the cloud pivot. Her mandate treated culture as an operating lever. The business outcome already had a name.
Yeah, in that conversation, the explicit mandate alignment before the search goes live, it's often the most valuable output of the entire process. And here's why. It forces a leadership team to surface disagreements about what the role is for that have probably existed and rarely been named out loud. And that surfacing up front, that clarity, is worth more than most of the candidate evaluation work that follows.
Yeah, so I think the question for leaders listening to this is, before the next search goes live, have you built the constraint map? Have you translated the job description into business outcomes? And have you explicitly aligned the mandate across every stakeholder who's going to work with that person that you're hiring? We've been talking about this in terms of CHROs, but the process that we're talking about really applies across the board. And if the answer to any of those questions, right, about the alignment or about the business outcomes or about the constraint map, the answer to any of those questions is no, then the design work that you need to do is not done, and the search should not start yet.
Yeah, to your point, we have CEOs that listen to the show. We also have a lot of search professionals that do so. And you got to have a clear answer to what business problem the person is being hired to solve before you start doing anything. So the question is, what can we do this upcoming week? And I'll take the first one. I think you need to, if you're thinking about making a change, you need to pull your current CHRO job description, run a simple audit. Count the bullet points that anchor to managing the function versus the bullet points that anchor to business outcomes. And I don't know what the right number is, but just for fun, if more than half of the document's about managing the function, you have a mandate design problem, and you need to pause because you're in the wrong place. You can't start there.
Right. Number two, constraint map. Build the constraint map before you write a single word of any job description, not just the CHRO. If you're writing a job description, build the constraint map first. It applies across the board. What are the two or three, in our CHRO case, what are the two or three human capital constraints that are most directly threatening your business objectives over the next 24 months? Write those at the top of the document. And every other requirement should trace back to one of those things that you're writing at the top.
Yeah, and then the third is to rewrite your success metrics in business language. So don't say stuff that I've seen in just about every place I've been. Build a high-performing HR team. So the good news is they're talking about team development as management deliverable, which is great. But I don't know what high-performing always means. If leadership bench strength is the constraint, the metric should be the percentage of pivotal roles with a credible internal successor within 18 months. So you got to get much more specific than where you are today. You got to make it measurable in the same terms that you would define success for with any of your other high-level operators.
I'll put a fourth one in there, which is you've got to align on the mandate before you start briefing the search firm. Hopefully, you're bringing them into that conversation rather than just handing it to them at the end, but it's got to be internally driven. Get the CEO, the board, executive team aligned around what the person owns, what they influence, what success looks like at 12, at 24, document it. And that document becomes your actual search brief.
Now, we've spoken most of this episode talking to CEOs and boards going through changes, and there are a bunch of CHROs saying, "Hey, what about me?" So let me give one. Let me give one for them. If you're currently sitting in a seat, you should have that mandate clarity conversation with your CEO now. Not at the next performance review, not when it's too late. Ask directly in terms of business performance. What does great look like for this role over the next 24 months? And get to a specific answer and measure it in business outcomes. Because if you can't, that's actually really important information about where the mandate stands and your place relative to it?
I'm going to throw a friendly amendment on the end of that one, Jackson, because, a lot of, and it's certainly been the case with me. I've asked that question before. I've tried to drive that conversation as a sitting CHRO, and I was surprised that I didn't get back what I thought I was going to get back. I got more speak about HR problems. I got more speak about HR programs. Don't let the conversation end there. Push it back into what we've been talking about, which is business outcomes. Now, you went to a sitting CHRO. I'm going to go to a high potential member of that CHRO's leadership team within the HR function. Give them an assignment. Give them the assignment of rewriting your current CHRO job description in business outcome language.
I like that.
What they produce is going to tell you something about their altitude and where they sit on the spectrum from functional expert to business operator. And you need to know that, because we shouldn't just be thinking about the rest of the business. We should also be thinking about our own teams and how we're going to build that altitude thinking into them.
Yeah. Okay. One final one, and that's before the job description is finalized. Like, pick someone who is not the CEO or the HR people to look at it. So maybe the CFO, not because the finance is going to own it. I get it. But a CFO is going to flag every requirement that doesn't have a business translation. They're pre-wired to do that. And if a CFO reads a bullet point and says, I don't know what that means, I don't know what that produces, then step back and say, I'm not sure that belongs in the mandate. And look, I do realize asking your CFO to review your CHRO job scorecard is not standard practice. Standard practice has been producing CHROs who are not operating at the business level, ones that get replaced at a unbelievably high clip. So let's do something different, because at some point the cost of that pattern is worth exploring and examining honestly. Okay, senior leaders, here is your favorite part of the show. It's the Talent Sherpa Summary, or as Scott always says, in rhyme form this time, the mandate is everything. The mandate is life. And if you write it right the first time, you will not need to call me twice.
No one has ever accused me of being Dr. Seuss. All right. Here are 3 takeaways. 1, the CHRO job description is a mandate signal. It tells every candidate what you believe the job is for, and it tells every new hire what success looks like before they start. If you write it as an HR function management document, you're going to produce an HR function manager. Number 2, the search doesn't start when you engage the search firm. That's just when the billing starts. It starts when you design the mandate. Start with the business constraints, not the HR competency list. Number 3, translate the success metrics into business language, the same way that the CFO does. Revenue per head, leadership bench depth, execution reliability. A metric that doesn't translate to a business outcome doesn't belong in the CHRO mandate. And the last one, 4, mandate requires explicit agreement from day one, right? The CEO, the board, the role holder, they all need to agree on what the person owns, what they're going to influence, and what winning looks like. The conversation is the real work. The job description is just the output of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And my takeaway from the episode is this. Most CHRO mandate failures are designed in before anyone is ever interviewed. The signal is set before the search begins. The misalignment is baked in before day one. And the fix has to be done upstream. You got to do the mandate design work before the search begins. And that work belongs to the CEO. Because when that mandate's built correctly before anything goes live, you have a completely different conversation with every single candidate. And you're going to be solving for the right problem from the beginning. And if you do that well, you can end up hiring someone who can actually solve it. So thanks so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast today. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. And I say this every week, but I mean it sincerely. This is so much fun to do with all of you. We are now building out people listening on 5 out of the 7 continents. And we came really close to the Arctic Circle, which is, I know, the opposite side of Antarctica, but it's close enough for us. And a quick shout out to one of our favorite listeners. Hello, Laura from Overland Park. Thanks for being a part of the Talent Sherpa community. And we want to thank everyone for listening, whether that's in Edinburgh, Scotland, or in Bellbrook, Ohio. It is great to have you with us.
If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and hit the like button right now. Just take 1 second. Or better yet, subscribe, or leave us a review. You can do it on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. We're on all of it. It benefits the community. Take a moment, just leave us a quick review. It's free. It's really helpful to us. And you know what you can also do? Share an episode with your CEO. Pull them into the conversation and let us help you build that way.
Amen. And look, if you're a CEO or a CHRO or someone on the senior team trying to figure out where to start your AI journey, don't forget to check out Propulsion AI. That's where Scott has founded a wonderful organization. You can find them at www.getpropulsion.ai. Scott, tell us a little bit about what you're building there.
Well, one of the things that we're building, we have a teammate named Athena. She's one of our digital teammates, and she coaches managers on building the kind of outcome clarity into what we call role blueprints that we've been talking about on today's episode. So check us out. Hey, and don't forget, if you're an early stage CHRO, if you're new to the role, Jackson's helped an awful lot of people in your same position through personal coaching, through the CHRO Ascent Academy, and through his best-selling Substack. You can find access to all three of those at www.mytalentsherpa.com.
And thanks, Scott. And thanks to everyone who's listening. Until next time, keep raising the bar. Keep designing the mandate before you post the job. And keep on climbing.